Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. How about going to Voronezh, Russia today? How about that? That's where we're going to go, and we're going to talk about the Moscow Helsinki group, which is my list of saints. And I'm going to talk to the co-chair of the Moscow Helsinki group, who's a much younger man than the people I got to know. And the man I'm going to talk to is the co-chair now of the Moscow Helsinki group. And his name is Dmitry Makarov, and he's in Voronezh, Russia. Good morning or good afternoon for you. It must be evening for you, is it?
It is evening. Yes. Hello, everyone. It's great to have to be on your podcast.
Well, it's the biggest thrill in the world for me to have an opportunity to get up to date with all of the doings of the Moscow Helsinki group, because I have interviewed in the past all of your great leaders, but they're all gone now. They're the founding people. I guess Lyudmila Alexeyeva died about 2-3 years ago.
In December 2019.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And Yuri Orlov is gone, and
Sergei Kovalyov has passed away last year as well.
And Sergei Kovalyov. Now let's see. I guess you still have Lev Ponomarov. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Although, we have a few members who have joined the rebuilt Moscow Helsinki group, the one that was re-established back in 1989. Because the first one was the first version was in 76.
Well, that's what I want to talk about. I wrote a book called The Russian Quest for Peace and Democracy, a large part of which was about these magnificent, brave people that I just had the greatest respect for and still do. So I want us to do kind of a history of the Moscow Helsinki group, because that first group of people underwent a great deal of sacrifice for their boldness in taking a position in what was then truly a totalitarian country. And later it got a little better. So how long have you been the co-chair, and who is the other co-chair?
Well, it took 3 men to replace one remarkable woman. So we have 3 co-chairs that were elected basically in January 2020, right after Lyudmila Alexeyeva has passed away. And the other 2 are Valery Borshov, one of the older generation of dissidents, and one of the founders of the new Moscow Helsinki group of back in 1989, right? And then the second one is Valery Bakhnin, who was actually who was very young when the original Moscow Helsinki group was founded, but he got some prison time in the Soviet times and was also a renowned Soviet dissident. So, and I kind of represent the younger generation, being still the youngest member of this established group.
Mm-hmm. And you live in Voronezh, and you spend all your time doing work for human rights organizations now, not just the Helsinki group, right?
That is true. I was part of a large international youth human rights movement network that worked throughout the post-Soviet space, not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine and Belarus, in the Southern Caucasus and in Central Asia. And we try to bring together the new generation of human rights defenders, kind of following in the footsteps of the Soviet era dissidents. And I still do some joint work, some joint projects with some of my colleagues from those countries.
Okay, well, why don't you just give us a history, some of which will be familiar to me, but not all, not by any means. Even the early days, I don't know everything, but it would be extremely important, I think, to have kind of a record of your understanding of the development of the Helsinki group. There was an agreement that there would be no challenge to the borders of any of the countries. And in exchange, sort of, for that, the Soviet government made some commitments to observe human rights. And then, so people in Russia began to see, aha, we have some leverage here because the Soviet government has made some promises now to observe human rights, and we can hold them to it. So they formed this group that began to demand the human rights that the Soviet government said they would do, which I'm sure they never thought they'd have to live up to it, but they did. Now, is that sort of how the whole thing began?
Oh, roughly. The dissident movement, the human rights movement, managed to put, in a way, human rights at the center of this West versus East battle. And basically, the Soviet dissidents, with Yuri Orlov having the brilliant idea, they basically started this group, which was formally called Moscow Group of Assistance, is actually arguing that they are there to assist the governments, not only the Soviet government, but all the governments, in pursuing their joint commitments to human rights. So basically, out of the Moscow apartments, they addressed Western diplomats on the other side of the border with calls to release political prisoners or to pay attention to other human rights issues in the Soviet Union. And that approach proved effective, not only in the sense that it got the regional Moscow Helsinki group either imprisoned or exiled, but in a sense that it got the attention of the world.
What years were all these things happening?
Well, the Helsinki Act was 75, and the Moscow Helsinki Group was established in May 12, 1976.
So it was pretty soon after that.
It was pretty soon. And actually, the Soviets considered the Helsinki Act a diplomatic achievement. It was published in Pravda, unlike Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as you probably know, was not published in the Soviet Union and was actually, during searches, they took it away as legal literature. The Helsinki Act was considered a diplomatic success because it basically recognized the borders, the spheres of influence of the Soviet Union.
Okay, how did even the Helsinki Act come into being? I don't even know the history of who took the initiative in making that happen. This would have been in Brezhnev's day, right?
It was in Brezhnev days. I'm not sure also who was the initiator of it, but the negotiations were around borders, around security issues, around basically recognizing the status quo. And somehow part of that status quo was also making a general commitment to human rights. And the argument behind that was that the security should not only be measured by, military means, and not only in terms of economic, technological security, but also in terms of how humans feel. And that's where Soviet Union had some difficulties, to put it mildly, and the Soviet dissidents used that. And it was basically a moral call to the people of goodwill across both sides of the Berlin Wall to recognize that once you make commitments, you have to follow them. And those are joint commitments by both parties, so to say, although signatories were not only Soviet Union and the NATO bloc, that was basically the entire, Western powers, including the USA, Canada, and European countries on one side, and the Soviet Union and the other countries of the Warsaw Bloc on the other side.
Yeah. Okay. And who, I mean, on the West, who were the main players in doing this negotiation?
Well, I'm not sure about the negotiation part, but I know that the start of the Helsinki movement was also helped by the establishment of the Helsinki Committee of the Congress in the US, the one that considered especially this third dimension to the agreement, the human dimension. So basically,
These were Americans, or are you talking about New York as the UN?
No, I'm talking about Americans. I'm talking about the Helsinki Committee, which is still in function. It's called like that. It's
I don't know anything about them. It's not interesting.
Well, yeah, they are still there, and I actually done a podcast for them a while ago, and they are still looking into various human rights issues.
Okay.
And back then, they were quite a voice, also a needed voice for Soviet dissidents.
Yeah, I've never even looked into the history of how they have it met. There were people who met in Helsinki, or where did the word Helsinki come from in this initiative?
Well, the Helsinki Act was signed in Helsinki. Yes, so that's how it got the name, and that's how the Moscow Helsinki Group also got its name, and then other Helsinki committees. And as you rightfully point out, the American Helsinki Committee, the non-governmental one, it was called Helsinki Watch originally, and then it became Human Rights Watch, the world-renowned human rights organization. So as we'd like to joke, it's not the West that put human rights on the agenda. It's actually the Soviets that started the international human rights movement.
Yeah. Okay. So, but now these people who founded the Helsinki group, were they already acquainted? Had they been doing? I know that I remember reading Lyudmila's books about even during the thaw, back in Khrushchev's day. I think there was a period when there were, it was possible to associate to some extent. I think she was already engaged at that point. So there must have been a network of dissidents even before the Helsinki group was founded, right? They must have known each other. And who were anybody from whose names I would recognize as members of the group?
Natan Sharansky, who was part of Refusnik movement, the Jewish movement to get out of the USSR. Of course, and I mean Yuri Orlov, a famous physicist, who came up with the idea, and the press conference to launch Moscow Helsinki Group was actually held at Andrei Sakharov's apartment. So he was not part of the original.
He was not part of that group, though.
He was not, but his wife did become. Elena Bonner did become.
She joined.
Yes, it was sort of. I mean, Andrei Sakharov was not a big fan of any type of association. He wanted to act alone. But yes, the symbolic capital was there. Some of those people were well known in the dissident circles already. But the revolutionary idea behind that it was not confrontational. It was about assisting the government in following its obligations. And that's how kind of they used the system against itself, basically. So the group was saying that we are assisting the states to follow the obligations. If they are serious about it, they must be vocal about it, and they should not persecute people who bring attention to violations of those commitments. And the revolutionary nature of the Helsinki Act was basically saying that this is a joint responsibility. human rights and the rule of law are a joint responsibility because they are a factor of security, just as much as military, or just as much as economic security. And I think that idea still rings true. That's why there have been talks about the Helsinki Accords, the new kind of the Helsinki 2.0. There was a lot of talk about it in the media prior to this past episode of Russian aggressive war. It started on February 24th, because as you know, there was already kind of annexation and aggression in 2014. But the episode that got everyone's attention started on February 24th. And prior to that, there was already discussion about the new security architecture for Europe. And some of thinkers branded it as Helsinki 2.0. Of course, all of that has been shattered on February 24th. But I think the idea is still relevant. That you cannot.
Oh yeah, of course. We're skipping from the beginning to the end. Let's
Yes.
put in the middle.
Yeah,
Because
well, I have to say also that I'm not really a historian. I mean, but of course I know the history, including from the stories of the founders who I had an honor to meet and to work together with. But some of the historic episodes might be, I know, just not fresh in my memory, but I do think it's a great story that everyone should read and learn about.
Well, exactly. And I'm not the one to tell it, right? Well, I might have been, 25 years ago, but I've forgotten a lot. And you can, I'm sure that your memory is a lot fresher than mine about that period. But I do know, they did. How did they function for the first year or two? And then when did they begin to get persecuted for their confronting? And you say they didn't confront, but I kind of had the idea that they were openly demanding changes from the regime.
And of course, that was not tolerated.
And so how soon were they in trouble? And I know that they began to be, some of them had to leave, some of them, Yuri Orlov had to go to Siberia. How many other people did? Tell us, who were the people who did they break up the group? What all happened?
They did have to stop the group quite soon, in a few months' time. But actually, the movement has started, and other groups have been established in other Soviet republics, and also in abroad as well. And yes, Yuri Orlov was sentenced to colony, basically to Siberia, and Lyudmila Alexeyeva had to leave the country, and she helped to establish International Helsinki Federation,
Are you talking about Lyudmila Alexeyeva?
Yes, I do.
She came to the U.S. She became a U.S. citizen. Did you know? Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do know that. Yes. But basically what the group did in the beginning, it was basically engaged in monitoring. It collected data about human rights violations. And that data started pouring in from different minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, from different corners of the Soviet Union. And the group even did investigative visits, for example, to Lithuania, to Ukraine. They went and they actually investigated some of the allegations that were made about human rights violations. And of course, there was already a network of dissidents working throughout that shared the information. And then basically they published so-called Хроника текущих событий, the chronicle of current events, famous dissidents. They published a chronicle of current events, kind of a digest of violations, and send it out to Western countries, basically to the members, to the signatories of the Helsinki Accord. And probably it's not right to say to Western countries, because they send it basically to pretty much all the signatories, saying that it's joint responsibility to pay attention to those violations.
And what was the reaction to that in these other countries?
Well, as I said, in the US, the Helsinki Committee, the official part of not the non-governmental group, but basically uh, the official commission at the Hill at the Senate or at Congress was established,
They did.
bipartisan.
Congress
Yeah.
took action and demanded things, or what?
Yes, they did, and they
Mhm.
also said that this should be part of the foreign policy of the United States. And of course, if Jimmy Carter coming in as a president, that also played a role in the larger geopolitical share of things. But basically, what it did, it highlighted the importance of non-governmental participation in those diplomatic exchanges. And OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, organization that basically came out of the Helsinki Accords,
Mhm.
the Helsinki Act, is still the organization, one of the most open ones to the non-governmental participation. At the annual Human Dimension Implementation meeting in Warsaw that take place every year, basically, at a large roundtable, you can see both the representatives of the participating states and representative NGOs.
Now, so the group as such was broken up and could not function for how long?
They ceased to function pretty soon, but the Helsinki groups outside of Moscow, they continue to work.
Okay.
Because, I mean, as I said, there was a Lithuanian Helsinki group. There was a Helsinki group in Georgia. There were Helsinki groups in the Netherlands, in the UK also, and then of course in the US as well.
Helsinki Watch, yeah. Now, how much connection was there among these groups?
Well, as I said, the federation was formed in the 80s, which was quite active. So it was an international Helsinki Federation that functioned quite actively and became one of the renowned international organizations. Unfortunately, it dissolved in beginning of 2000s, and the connection within the movements, many connections within the movements were broken, although some of the Helsinki groups continue to cooperate. And most of them still carry, the name and continue the legacy.
If the Moscow group was broken up, how did the other groups elsewhere in Russia continue to function anyway?
Well, the groups in the Soviet Union were basically all cracked down. The ones that continued to function were the ones outside of
I see.
Soviet Union. If we're talking about the 70s, of course, then later on, I mean, a lot more groups were established. For example, in the Balkans, in the 90s, a lot of Helsinki groups appeared also carrying that name.
I
Norwegian
guess
Helsinki Committee, the Netherlands Helsinki Committee are still very big and respected human rights organizations that continue to function bearing that name. The Swedish Helsinki Committee became Civil Rights Defenders, also one of the largest human rights groups in Sweden, functioning, well, working not only in Sweden, but also throughout the world, basically. But originally it was the Swedish Helsinki Committee.
now the people in Russia and these other groups in the regions and so on, were they also persecuted to the same extent as the Moscow group leaders? Did some of them go to exile, or some of them go to Siberia to work camps and so on, the way Yuri Orlov did?
Well, yeah, in particular, Ukrainian Helsinki Union was naturally a subject of persecution, but it was also true for Lithuanian group, for instance, with some of the people being forced into exile.
There were other people who took independent positions, either on their own or they were in some other way bold. For example, I knew Fyodor Berlatsky quite well. And he and Lyudmila had some problems. I think he was put in charge of, I think even before Gorbachev's period, I believe he was given some responsibility for looking after a group of religious people, I think some sort of Pentecostals or something. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I'm not sure about that, but I do know that there were some groups that focused specifically on freedom of conscience and religious issues. And for Moscow Helsinki group, it was also one of the key issues right from the start. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure about other groups, though.
Mm-hmm. I met Sergei Grigorians, and my impression is that he's not part of the Helsinki group, but he did independent work and still does.
Yes, yes, he does. He was not part of the Moscow group members, but he was a renowned, journalist and political prisoner, and one of the founders of the Glasnost Foundation, as far as I remember.
What foundation?
Glasnost Foundation, which was instrumental, around Glasnost as a freedom of speech.
Yes.
A term fundamental to Gorbachev's perestroika.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I when I was first going to Russia to Moscow as a guest of the Soviet Peace Committee, because they were inviting peace activists as if we had some sort of influence or something, but they would bring us in for these conferences and so on. And I was very surprised because some of the very high level people would give me signals that they were really hoping that I would speak out in favor of, every time I did speak out in favor of human rights or something, they would basically, cheer me on. You could tell from the way they put it. The official at the table where we were having these conferences, they would say all the correct official things. But the minute if we'd have a coffee break, they'd come in and say, yeah, that's it, keep it up, And if I forgot to or didn't mention it in one of these meetings, they would say to me, hey, we want you were doing it last time. Why don't you talk about that again? We really want you to talk about human rights. And all this time I would be going out and visiting people in the Moscow Group for Trust, which was another independent peace group, a human rights, but mostly critical of the nuclear threat that was existing between the East and West at the time. But I had a network of these wonderful people that I would go visit, and they would not, these two groups were completely opposed, didn't like each other, didn't trust each other, yet they were both exactly wanting the same kinds of things. So Berlatsky is an example of somebody who would be, I'd call him a termite, because he was working within the system and all of the people around Gorbachev I've been told at least 1 million party members who were working to try to bring in democracy and other valuable things, that they were very much appreciated the position that we were taking, that I was taking anyway, maybe not all of the Western peace activists. But, the two groups didn't have any use for each other. And these, I call the termites the people within the party who were trying to make changes. And the same changes were being promoted by these other people who I called barking dogs, because they were the real dissidents who got in trouble, and they would be they'd be ostracized, or they'd be beaten up by the police, or they'd be sent to the jail and all kinds of things. And yet, they wanted the same things. are you aware of how, or were they aware of the fact that that there were like-minded people inside the party trying to do the same things, but they didn't want to work together?
Well, I think understandably so, there was a lot of mistrust towards the system that abused for so many years those people who stood up for their beliefs. And I
Mhm.
mean, being the human rights defenders, the Soviet dissidents, being witnesses to such abuse or being victims of such abuse, I would understand why they would not feel for anyone associated with the party or the system. But I do believe that at that time there were good people also trying to work for the same purpose. It's just that it's hard to build those bridges. I mean, it's still hard. I mean, in today, for instance, I do believe that still, despite all the horrible things that are being committed now in Russia's name, there are people in Russia who want good things, including the ones who are reevaluating their affiliation with the government, who are either leaving or who are trying to convince themselves that there are still good things to be done in the system. And I think it's a hard position also, because eventually, in order to achieve long-term systemic change, you need allies in the system. You need to work throughout your differences, throughout your political differences, and find something that you agree on. If you agree on that, what Russia needs is a a peaceful and kind of tolerant, sustainable future in good relations with its neighbors. And basically, if it has to take responsibility for the crimes committed in its name, then I mean, it's something that we can work around. And I would imagine how hard it was back then. I imagine that it's hard still now.
Do you think now, I mean, this, we're skipping again to the present, and I want to fill in the blanks about the past, but you're suggesting that now there are people, even perhaps in the government, who would like to make some changes, or not?
I do think so. Perhaps not in the direct position, of main responsibility, not the ones who are given orders to engage in this military operation, but the ones on the lower level. I think, yeah, there are many of them who are having at least second thoughts, and I know that many of them have left their positions, not willing to make those compromises, but there are those who are still there and who somehow tell themselves that there still needs to be things, there still need to be things, there are still things that need to be done in order for the country to run, despite the crimes committed by the political leadership.
Well, I don't have the kind of network that I had in those days, because back 35 years ago, I knew maybe hundreds of people who were in pretty important positions. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I don't know. A lot of people I knew anyway, and I interviewed a lot of hundreds. But I don't have any contacts with people in the official Putin regime, the government now. I don't know any of those folks, but I do know a few people who are not in the government, but whom I knew 30 years ago, who were termites then, and still are in positions of some responsibility. And I'm not going to name any names now, because I think both, I'm only thinking of two, but I can think of 3 or 4 more others. People who, in fact, several people more. I could probably think of 10 people that I have some acquaintance with, but I'm not in touch with now, because I don't want to get them in trouble. And I'm not sure how truthful or frank they can be. Some of them I see on international television, like some of these people are actually interviewed on CNN and places like that. So I know that they're still very influential. And I knew them when they were, definitely not, they were in opposition to Brezhnev's government. Okay. So, what's going on in their minds now, and why they decide to make the kinds of compromises that they're making. I presume they think if they stay somehow in power that they'll have some kind of beneficial effect, or maybe they just plain don't want to give up all their perquisites.
Isn't that the dilemma that most of the ruling class in Russia has been facing? I mean, it has been turning away from many of the kind of crimes committed by the regime before. I mean, for human rights defenders, it's no surprise. I mean, of course, I mean, Ukraine is in the news, it's in the world's viewpoint, and it's rightfully so. But before that, there was Chechnya, there was Syria, and many people inside the government, inside the international organizations, inside the Western political classes also chose to turn a blind eye to that as well. So it's not, I mean, it's not only those compromises that people inside the Putin system are making, those are the compromises that probably most of us are making too.
Yeah, I would say
aside from a handful of activists that continue to criticize the Russian government, or all the other governments for that fact, for the atrocities committed in their name.
Even during that Chechen war, that first Chechen war, there were reasons to say he was not a promising democratic leader. But I want, and even that book, Blowing Up Russia with Litvinenko, I actually asked Sergei Kovalyov about that book, because he did some sort of inquiry when he was in the Duma about that, but he said he couldn't. These people were not under oath. He couldn't couldn't swear them, so he couldn't be sure that what they told him was true. And that he thought there were a lot of things wrong with that book, but there was definitely enough there to really alarm anybody in terms of evidence about what Putin was doing even then, blowing up those apartment buildings and that sort of thing. So I think there has to have been some truth in quite a bit of truth in that. So I would talk to people, and my friends a lot of them would say, well, we don't like him, but if you tried to do, if we got rid of him, there would just be chaos in Russia, and that there's not the conditions for democratic self-government have not been created. As a matter of fact, Alexeyeva said something like that to me. She said, give us another 15 years and we will know how to take care of ourselves. She said, the people, I was saying things like, if I were in prison and somebody came and let me out, and I would thank him and I would be on his side and I'd be grateful. But when Gorbachev comes along and liberates, people from the kinds of oppression that had existed before, they don't like him and they don't have any use for him, and they aren't grateful. And I don't understand that. And she said, but our people have been so dependent on the government that they don't know how to take care of themselves like grown-ups. And we have to learn all over again how to be self-reliant and make our own decisions and things like that. And then we can do political actions that maybe we could be democratic, but it's going to be another 15 years. Well, that was probably 20 years ago when she told me that. But I was always trying to figure out why people were not more vigorous in demanding their rights, and in the Russian Russian people in particular, although, you know, all throughout the Soviet Union, the same thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that puzzles many too. My answer is that people have their fears, and they have all the reasons to fear, because they had a history when, for a small gesture of dissent, you can end up in a camp or in a prison, or before that you can just be plainly shot, you know, by after decision by troika, you know, by not even by a court, just by executive branch. And that's kind of, that is embedded, especially in the older generation, the generation that is a backbone of support for Putin now. And part of that fear is instilled in new generation too. And also there's a fact of, you know, learned helplessness, you know, something, a belief that nothing depends on you, that everything has been decided. For example, my generation already, I mean, I became politically active in 2000. All I remember is Putin being in power. We haven't seen any other president, if not to count 4 years of Medvedev as an interim, you know, place holder. But other than that, my generation also has not seen any victories, basically. Has seen the kind of a decline in that. So aside from fear, there is an apathy, and there's a certain level of cynicism, and a certain level of, you know, selfishness. People, you take care of yourself first, you take care of your family, and then you look out for the outside. And that's something, this kind of attitudes are the ones that got us into the state that we are at the moment. And of course,
well, there are people in other countries, though, that took positions. You know, we had these color revolutions throughout Europe, and
right.
And people who were bold enough to stand up against the government and make demands, and yet the Russians were the least of all open to that. I remember counting up the demonstrations in the size of the demonstrations in Belgrade against Milosevic, for example. Belgrade's a tiny fraction of the size of Moscow. I mean, maybe 10, Moscow must be 10 times as big. I don't know, something like that. And yet, you know, there'd be hundreds of thousands of people in Belgrade. And if you try to have a demonstration in Moscow, you might get 1,000 or up to 5,000 at the most. So, and, you know, is it fear or is it something else?
Well, I mean, we had our fair share of massive mobilizations, including in the conditions just as repressive as Milosevic regime. I mean, people were out in the streets. They still are out in the streets. If we are to measure mobilization or discontent based on street presence, but the situation now in Russia is different than it was during the so-called color revolutions. And also, I mean, the regime learned its lessons. The color revolution was a scare for the regime for many years, and it prepared directly to address that threat. But I wouldn't actually speculate that Russian people are that much different. I mean, we have our own historical peculiarities, but just as many others. Throughout Russian history, there have been brave people that stood up in the harshest circumstances for freedom. I mean, Moscow Helsinki Group is one example that we have been discussing in detail, but there have been many others as well. So I don't think that in that sense we're that much different. The political conditions are different, just as they are different in Serbia now as they were back then and with Milosevic in power. I mean, but the Putin as a phenomenon did not fall out of the sky. It was built up, and it's not a unique Russian phenomenon. I mean, that's something that I've been trying to argue across, you know, citizens' assemblies, across many, you know, peace gatherings, that we have to unite efforts as a in global anti-war efforts, because what we are facing is not just a Russian threat. It's not just the the specific regime that is unique only to Russia. It's a global phenomenon of populism, of crony capitalism, of belief that might makes right, that you can that war can be a solution to your own domestic problems, and it could be a power game in the international geopolitics as well. And that's a
Yeah.
belief shared by many, not only in Russia, unfortunately.
Mhm. No, that I worry about it all the time. Why the explanation for this worldwide trend? I don't know whether it's the same thing everywhere though, but it may
Well,
be.
of course it is unique, but the trends are there. The trends of this sort of populism, the trend of this sort of kind of that the people don't know better. We must decide for them. We might manipulate them, and basically that profits and power gains matter more than human lives.
Now, I'm aware that there's been for what 10, 12 years an increasing crackdown against civil society and any potential source of opposition to the regime there. And I know that they introduced this law about where you will be considered a foreign agent under certain circumstances if you have assistance from foreigners. But what are the real limits of what you can do? I'm surprised that the Helsinki group is alive and functioning, because I think various organizations, I believe the Mothers of Soldiers, haven't they been shut down? The memorial has been shut down. What are the various, of course, they kicked out all the Soros-funded groups quite a while ago, right? What has been the history of the collapse or the repression of independent activism in Russia in the last, 15 years or 10 years?
Well, I mean, there are several dimensions to it. First, there was the NGO field or NGO dimension of it. And of course, a lot of it was dependent on foreign funding. And there was a kind of a vulnerable spot which the government hit. So basically, it said that if you get foreign funding and you are engaged in political activity, you can be labeled foreign agent, which is a basically derogatory term. And there are several restrictions on your activity that you have to undergo. And Moscow Helsinki Group was among the first that said that we are no longer accepting foreign funding because we don't want to take up that label. And basically all human rights NGOs and other civil society groups said that we are not accepting that label voluntarily. So they had to make a number of amendments to actually force that label on groups. And some of them were forced to close down. And Memorial is the most visible example of it just recently. So there is a gradual escalation in the pressure since 2012, basically. It didn't come overnight. And so the legislation, the repressive legislation in that sense, kept on expanding. And the borders of what is considered foreign funding and the borders of what is considered political activity has remained ambiguous. So basically the government can select its victims, can select the groups it wants to go after. And some have not received the label, others have. For some continue the activities, some had to stop. And until recently, no major organizations were directly attacked, and Memorial was a major exception. And from what we see now, it has been probably in preparation for what we see now in Ukraine. So basically, to try to cut down the organized civic activism. It was done in a political sphere, going after Navalny and his network of opposition groups, closing out Khodorkovsky's structures, and then going after human rights defenders. At the same time, as I said, there's another dimension of it. The civic mobilization is still there. There's a lot of new groups that have been appearing. There's a lot of activism which may not be organized in a traditional NGO function of fashion. And so I'm actually quite optimistic. We never seen such a civic mobilization as recently in Russian history. So there's a lot of people going out on the streets, a lot of people engaged in
Now?
various. Yes, still. I mean, 16,000 people were arrested over the past 5 months just for voicing opposition. It's not mass rallies. It's usually single pickets, but those go on every day. But once more, it's not measured in street demonstrations.
Well, I'm really delighted to hear that, because this is not, I heard of some early on, right shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, but I was not aware that public demonstrations are happening anymore. I got the idea that
they all have been banned. They are all completely illegal, but people have been going out. I mean, for example, in Moscow, even single pickets, I mean, single rallies, single person rallies are illegal. In other cities, it's not so. But people keep on going out regardless in Moscow and elsewhere. As I said, more than 16,000 people overall have been arrested for participating in street actions of any type. But this is just one indicator. There are, of course, many others. And there are a number of criminal cases for people voicing their opposition to the so-called military operation has been raising as well. And that's an indicator also. Despite the heavy risk of I mean, the real risk of a heavy sentence, people still voice the opposition. Many were forced to flee as well and speaking out from abroad. But as I said, in terms of grassroots mobilization, there's been actually unprecedented. It's not enough, unfortunately, to stop a war, but it is something to build upon.
I'm delighted to hear that. That is really news to me. I guess I had the impression that it really had been repressed sufficiently so that people couldn't do it and weren't doing it.
Well, it has been suppressed to make it much less effective than it could have been in a freer society. But, and of course, the targets, as I said in the beginning, was the infrastructure, the human rights groups, the opposition groups, the entire infrastructure that could provide some sort of organization. So most of what we see now is basically symbolic protest. It's people saying that we cannot tolerate this. We have to do something. It doesn't have much effect other than just showing that there is there are voices of dissent, that there is opposition to government's policies. It doesn't have an effect or an influence over those policies.
Yes, well, now, you know, we can't send you money, and not that necessarily I have any I want to give away right today anyway, but you know, we can't, people in North America and Europe and so on can't support you in certain ways, because that would immediately make you into a foreign agent, right? And your group would be broken up. But is there any other way in which we can support each other and work together? I think I do have a talk show the last Sunday of every month. I have a Zoom global town hall, and people from various countries join in, including at least one guy from Russia. And so far, he's not gotten in trouble, but like you, he's not sure what might happen, but he's bold enough to go ahead with it. But I would think it would be desirable, if we can do it, to create ongoing conversations by Zoom between groups of people in various countries, including Russia. And I don't know what more we can do except just to talk to each other and send our love to each other, what do you think? Is there any way in which we can really work together?
I mean, conversation is a first step. I do think there are also other things that could be done. I mean, you could, I've written a number of actually recommendations of what could be done, and I'd be happy to share it. I mean, together with Mary Calder from Helsinki Citizens Assembly. I mean, we even published a few months ago already an article saying that it's not only Ukrainian resistance that can end this, it's also the Russian opposition to the war that can stop it. And I still believe that is true. I still believe that it's not only about the calls for military support that we keep on hearing, which I personally have very ambiguous feelings about, because I don't like the war being fed by any means. But who I am to condemn those calls, right? But at the same time, we as peace activists, the ones who are opposed to military aggression, we should put our minds together about what could be done, and instead of severing connections, cutting connections, I mean, we should build connections. There needs to be a discussion of what could be done together as a global human rights or as a global anti-war movement, and there could be things done.
I have actually approached, I sent emails to a couple of people who are known to be dissidents, if you will, who live near St. Petersburg, and proposed that we have a conversation about setting up a regular dialogue by Zoom, conversations every so often. I'd be happy to host such a thing. If we can have these conversations, there are plenty of people that I know in Canada or Europe who would love to be part of it too. So we could have a conversation every so often. But these people never replied, and I don't know whether to probe further. Do you have any good ideas of how I could help set up something like that?
I think it might be worthwhile to focus maybe on certain professional groups who can talk, or maybe, I mean, I like the idea of university dialogues also. And there are also, as a target group, there are also all sorts of initiatives of Russians abroad, the ones that were leaving Russia now, that could be a good counterparts actually, and who be much more willing to speak and feeling much more comfortable in speaking out than the ones that are left in Russia. So people, as I said, fear dominates, and I mean, there are reasons to be cautious for people who have decided to stay forward. But of those who are outside of Russia, they are looking to be engaged, and some of them, I think, also need to think a bit beyond that. I think we need, as a community, we need to learn about experiences of dealing with conflicts like that, or with transformations like that outside of Russia. Most of the examples that we have are coming from Germany or South Africa at best. But there are other countries that have dealt with conflicts or with post-war situations that might be good, relevant reference points. Let's put it this way. So there needs to be also research, academic research on how did we end up in this point of history, because there's been a lot of misunderstanding also towards Russia and the post-Soviet space, I think. A few years ago, I had a conversation with academics from the Netherlands, for example, that complained that most of the focus now is on regions outside of a post-Soviet space, and that the research, for example, on Russia has been undercut. And they are feeling that it's kind of missing the bigger picture, and we see now that they were right.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to meet you, and I hope we have a lot more ways of cooperating in the future. Okay?
Yes, thanks a lot for doing this.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone is welcome to Project Save the World's Global Town Hall on the last Sunday of every month from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time Zone in North America. Our Zoom number is zoom.us/j/910-897-0203. See you there. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode number 482. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get there, look around. We have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts. This is a place for dialogue. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.